Zach, you good to go?
Yeah, I just need to share my screen, right? So
Yep.
Share. Let's go to desktop. You guys good? You guys see my screen?
Yes, sir.
All right, so how's everybody doing? My name is Zach Higginbotham. I'm the Associate Head Strength Coach here at FAU with Joey. Glad I'm here, honored to speak, and I'm glad all y'all stuck around and watched. Today, I'm going to be speaking on overspeed sprinting, considerations and applications in collegiate football and overall field sport athletes, really. I want to give a big thank you to some of my mentors, former supervisors, and also give credit to people I've stolen information from. Again, I'm not the smartest guy around. I'll just say I'm lucky enough to learn how to emulate and do good work from other people I've watched. So I want to give a big thank you to Scott Sinclair, Joe Walker, Orlando Smith, Austin Ardrey, Joey Garasio, John Garish, Kier Wenham Flatt, Al Miller, Rob Panarello, Johnny Parker, Miki Murati, Kurt Hester, and a ton of other people that have helped me along the way. There's a lot of other people I couldn't name. So I just want to say thank you to them. And then others in the bottom, I just want to say thank you for providing good work and being able to help develop athletic development in your own athletes and help and give us tools that progress our athletes as coaches. So again, like I said, I'm the creator of none and stealer of everything, as Coach Parker would say. Let's see if this will change. Maybe. All right, so sorry about that. So when it comes to running, it's simple, right? Just run fast. Rest, yes and no, right? It depends. Sorry about that. This computer's a little slow. It's a pretty big file. All right, so the intent to run fast is simple, right? It just run fast, right? You try really hard, give great effort, right? But what happens when that no longer works? What happens when the basics no longer work, right? Every principle we're taught as coaches, we're taught as athletes, is from a bottom-up approach, from slow to fast, from simple to easy, a bottom-up approach to athletes. Even like when we're taught to coach, we're taught to teach from the ground up, right? But what happens when that no longer works? What happens when our athletes become stagnant and we have to find new ways to address these focuses, specifically sprinting? What happens if we approach sprinting itself with a top-down focus and we address it from the brain to the floor instead of the floor up? Why is this not changing? Right. So you look at athletic development, right? The reason why speed is so important is it's the high point of the pyramid. It's the peak of athletic development. Alvermere will tell you in his hierarchy development. I know you guys have seen this a ton in terms of this specific pyramid of development, right? But the biggest reason why is the reason why everybody's telling to do it. You talk about residual effects and residual effects of training. Everybody's talking about it, so it sounds like the key phrase, and it's kind of falling mute a little bit on Twitter. Everybody's talking about it because it's so important, right? There's such a trickle down effect to how we're teaching these things and how we're training our athletes, because it has the biggest bang for its buck in terms of affecting all points of the pyramid, right? And as Tony Holler would say, in terms of why it's important, speed grows like a tree, right? Plant early and plant often. That's why I put bamboo trees in my title page. Everybody's like, why the hell are you doing that? Right? Because it takes the bamboo tree at least 2 years to sprout from the ground, right? So we have to plant early, right? We have to find a way to prioritize it early on in training, make it a priority, right? And then we also have to find a way to effectively train it year round and all the time and make it a priority, right? Because you have to, when you look at the bamboo tree, you have to nurture, you have to grow it, you have to be patient, you have to be diligent, because it takes 2 years to sprout from the ground, and you have to be patient and diligent with it. Let's see. Right, and in terms of sports, like in terms of field sport athletes and football, what do we care about speed? What pieces specifically? Because you're going to hear a lot of terms and a lot of vague track terms and stuff that don't necessarily apply to field sport athletes when there's so many different things we have to affect, right? The two biggest pieces we're going to look at today and talk about today, and I think are most important, is max velocity, which is honestly the only way to look at it is the highest point of velocity you can reach per unit of time or overall, right? What is the highest attainable velocity that athlete can reach, right? And acceleration, the rate of change to get to the highest velocity. How long can they accelerate? Because the faster the athlete, the longer they're in accelerate, right? And then you look at how all these different pieces we're going to talk about today flow into, and I want to give a little bit of background information when we start talking about these different things and different principles, because they're so important, right? Or posture, intent, and dosage. When you think about posture, right? It's so important, one, because if they can't hit these certain positions and postures we talk about, Altus refers to it as shapes, right? They're not going to be able to maximize their force production, their force capabilities. And secondly, for our end of what we need to do, right, is they have to play the sport. So we have to keep them healthy, right? That's the biggest point of them being able to hit these postures and shapes we want is intent, right? The intent to do something and drive it with great intensity, right? To drive adaptation with sprinting, right? You can't sprint, you can't train with half effort. So, and then dosage. For us on our side of things, are we doing enough, one, to keep them healthy, drive adaptation, or are we doing too much, right? Now I know you guys have seen this chart a ton, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but essentially sprinting is so important because, again, it's the highest point of the threshold in terms of motor unit involvement, athletic development. I know if you guys have done any or half the webinars talk about on YouTube and Instagram and IG, everybody's talked about this. So I'll just touch on a little bit. The reason why we program sprints is because there's such a high involvement, right? So I'll go into it. Now, kind of getting into the nitty gritty, get a little more specific, getting closer to our goal of the conversation, right? Is how does all this play into field sport athletes and track athletes, right? Because when you think about hip height, ground contact times, all these differences between field sport athletes, right? Are these golden positions, are these shapes that we're asking our players and our athletes to get into that are based off track athletes, are they synonymous with what we want to do, right? Are they actually attainable? Right? Because elite sprinters are going to get good front side lift. They're going to be able to create more vertical force because they attack the ground from the top up. Because again, they create vertical force. They get that swing leg time to come through. They're going to strike in relative great position within the center of mass. And you look at field sport athletes. Field sport athletes are going to be the exact opposite, right? They're going to sag in their hips. A lot of times they're going to be push runners. A lot of football players are going to be quad and low back dominant. They're not going to rely on their hamstrings and their glutes, right? They're going to have longer ground contact times. They're going to strike less than the 4 foot, more of a full foot contact because of the proprioceptive and environmental changes they need where they have to change direction or react to a stimulus outside of them, right? And a lot of times, because of all these different effects, they strike outside of the front of their hip, and that's why a lot of guys, honestly, outside of mechanical issues or loading issues and tissue issues, they pull their hamstrings, right? So the short answer is yes. Like we want to be able to teach them and get them into these positions, but the reality of it is the demands of the game say they're probably not going to all the time, or they're not going to be able to based on some relative differences. What the hell? Sorry about that. Right. So now, first part of talking about overspeed and all these different pieces we're going to get into is dynamic systems theory, right? All it is the study of movement based on different interactions within the environment and the task and the individual, right? And how they all respond to create one overall unit, right? Franz Bosch is going to talk about it, how all these different positions and all these different environments, he talks about it a ton. There's certain things that stay the same no matter the constant or the constraints or the individual task and differences in task at hand. And there's some things that fluctuate based off these 3 different positions, whether it's individual, environmental, or task, right? The biggest piece we're going to talk about today that I think has the biggest outside of the box thinking when it comes to overspeed and sprinting, especially with field sport athletes, and honestly teaching in general, is motor learning, right? Because the body is so complex physiologically, the body restricts itself for safety reasons with degrees of movement, right? In order to to deal with all these differences and possibilities, right? So just think about a teaching progression. How would you teach a squat? How would you teach a kid to sprint? How would you teach a kid to clean? Right? Usually it's going to be a part hold method or a part hold method, right? And you're going to teach slow to fast, simple to complex, goblet squat, the front squat, the back squat. And you're going to add intensity. You're going to add variation. All these different ways to challenge the body and groove these optimal positions we're looking for, right? And we'll get into how they fit into dynamic systems theory here in a second, right? But if you really want to get deep down into the weeds, and I'll touch on it here in a second, but I want to get to the good stuff, right? If you look at some of the ideas of motor learning, where it comes from Franz Bosch or Nikolai Bernstein, you look at the motor pathways and motor learning, right? It falls in a parabolic relationship, right? Early on, you watch your athletes, you watch how they're learning and figuring out the movement. You're trying to coach them and cue them, right? They don't have a lot of ways because they don't understand these movement patterns, how to problem solve, right? So you get kids, you say you're squatting them, right? And they're shaking like a stripper. They don't have great motor control, right? They don't have a lot of ways to show mastery in the movement. But as you cue them and they rep it and they figure it and they organize themselves, right? They fall into that level 2 where they limit their degrees of freedom and they're starting to gain technical mastery, right? And as they get there, And as they get there, right, the movement, and they can start exploring, and they start gaining degrees of freedom, right? And as they get those degrees of freedom, we have to find ways to challenge them, right? So we have to find ways to change the environment, to change the stimulus, right? And that's coaching in a nutshell, right? Because we're trying to drive adaptation, we're trying to drive stimulus. Right? Now, again, everybody's kind of like, what the hell are we talking about? I thought overspeed just meant towing and above maximal velocity, above maximal peak velocities and all these different things, right? But when we challenge the body through specific tasks and through the environment and your self-constraints, right, we're forcing the body to respond in a more perfect manner. We might be forcing things to happen faster, right? Because the idea is we're trying to force a neurological response from the brain. Remember, we're teaching it from the top down. So we're forcing a fight or flight response, right? Because why? Because if you don't run better, you don't run faster, you don't improve, the proverbial bear, or in this case, a hippo, is going to get you, right? If old boy doesn't get to a toe-off position, he's going to get eaten, and that ain't good. Right? Now, when you start getting into how these different pieces change and don't change and how they move, right? You start talking about, Franz Bosch can refer to them as attractors and fluctuations, right? Attractors are those basic movement patterns that don't change, right? Those are those golden positions we're looking to get to and find it, as Stu McMillan referred to as a bandwidth, right? We're trying to fit into that certain bandwidth within the golden position, right, that we want. Fluctuations are all those different pieces we talked about, the environment, the task, or the individual, that all might change based off a given stimulus. Those are all those different pieces. And if you look at the page, you look at the picture on the side, right? Those attractive positions, right? We want to deepen them. And as they learn, the motor learning and improves, and as we expose them to, right, those attractor wells deepen. Same thing with the fluctuations, right? But the attractor positions are more ingrained. And what we're trying to do is get the body to accept those attractors and be able to get to those attractors and golden positions faster and more frequently based off the given fluctuations, right? Maybe. Apologize. Right? So for sprinting, here we go. When we get to sprinting, we talk about all these different golden positions and attractors and fluctuations, right? What are these attractors, right? And these are the different positions you're going to hear me talk about today. Is toe off, MVP, strike, touchdown, full support. And we can get into the weeds a little bit on what these individual positions look like and how we get to them, and what they are in their whole. But at least we just want to show you guys. This is pulled straight from the Altus Kinogram method, from Altus and Stu McMillan and Dan Paff. And if you guys haven't read it, at least that, I would go right to it, because it's going to be able to help you, give you a coach's eye and help develop what you're looking for in sprinters and your athletes as a whole, right? Now, why is all this important, right? Why are we trying to develop these positions and obtain higher velocities and improve acceleration, right? And improve all this, right? Because if we make them faster, if we give them higher peak velocities, do we raise all that, right? We're going to raise their acceleration profile. And this is pulled straight from one of Ken Clark's, this graph right here is pulled straight from Ken Clark's presentation in 2017 at TFC. And I want to give him credit because the work he's done and that study was based off, that presentation was done off the study he did for the NFL Combine at 40-yard dashes, right? And what they found is when you raise the peak velocity, when you raise the highest attainable velocity or speed they can achieve, you raise their ability to accelerate. And what do coaches always tell you? Oh, it's an acceleration sport. Like, all we do is accelerate. How often do our athletes hit max velocity or get to a point to where we have to train those qualities, right? But again, if we raise the max velocity, if we raise their overall ability to velocity, they can accelerate for longer. So again, you think about, you watch two kids sprint, the faster kid, more than likely, when you watch the sprint, they're going to be pretty close early on, but you're going to see that other kids start to pull away because he can accelerate for longer. His rate of change is higher, right? Because he can get to a higher velocity, and the graph shows that, right? And remember, when we do this, we're trying to speed up the brain, right? We're trying to force it to respond in a more perfect manner. We're trying to speed the process up, right? So all this is going to start tying together. And the other thing is peak velocities, max velocity training is going to give you certain and specific neural adaptations you can't get in any other facility of training that you can get, right? So we're trying to load the CNS. We're trying to give it neural input. We're trying to do all these different things. And again, putting it all together, some of these points, I kind of jumped the gun a little bit. And you look at some more Ken Clark graphs from the same presentation. You can see all these different pieces, right? Faster athletes are going to accelerate for longer. They're going to be able to create more net horizontal force, more vertical force. Their ground contact times are going to be shorter. They're going to be able to accelerate for longer. So when you look at all these different things, faster athletes, like for example, are going to create more force, and they're going to be able to reapply that force. So the ground contact times are going to be longer. And again, you can see where they apply for longer. And looking directly at football, right? You think about what do most coaches tell you? You look at most graphs with track related. They say, oh, got the 100-meter dash is going to anywhere based on ability. They're going to accelerate for 30 to 60 meters. But when you look at football, you're going to watch some linemen, and they're going to be in top end mechanics at 5 yards, right? And there's a lot of other factors that go into that. So some skilled players are going to be in top end mechanics at 10, 12 yards. I would, based off, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it's going to be right around 20 yards. They're going to be right around 90% of their max velocity. And that's going to be the rate of change. That's going to be minimal to none. And they still got half of the 40-yard dash to run. You want to watch your athletes and watch how they accelerate and how they change speeds. Like watch your shin angles, right? Because the shin angles are going to be able to tell you a lot more about the body and their abilities as a sprinter. And this will all kind of fit in more later once we start getting to some of the applied section and the drills. All right, you got to steal some time before the slide changes. Right, now, what does the research say? We talked about motor learning and how that fits in, and that's going to be a big piece of what we talk about. But now we're going to start talking about the 2-mass model, the stumble reflex, and assisted sprinting. And again, I want to give a big shout out to Chris Corfus, Tony Holler, Kim Clark, Peter Wayne, and a lot of these guys are light years ahead of all of us for kind of shedding a light on some of this stuff, because it's great stuff if you can learn how to apply it, learn how it fits what you and your program do, right? So what the hell is a 2-mass model, right? The 2-mass model, all it tells us, and I know Coach Joey talked a little bit earlier in his early presentation. All it tells us, it tells us how forces are applied, and velocities are improved, ground reaction forces are improved. And when to develop a good 2-mass model, you're going to see a great knee lift, right? Elite sprinters are going to get a great post position in that front side swing leg, right? They're going to be able to get maximal hip projection because there's a certain amount of time that swing leg is able to get through. And the more time you give that swing leg to get around and get an optimal position, the more it's going to be able to speed up and create force, right? Because I know you talk about the positioning, right? Think about a ballerina or an ice skater, right? And they start spinning in circles, right? When they pull that knee and they pull that leg in and they make that mass smaller, start speeding up, right? And what do when they slow down? They straighten that leg out. Well, when you think about your swing leg's the same thing, right? If I can get my hips higher and get to a bit more optimal position and get that swing leg up underneath the knee more and shorten the distance it takes to spin through, I can speed it up, right? And we know from the 2-mass model that the highest forces are obtained, the forces that are obtained and created in ground contacts is from that first position, right? Is that first stiff strike, how to speed up that swing leg and being able to slow down that swing leg, right? So once you make ground contact down, how quickly can I decelerate that swing leg? How can I create ground reaction forces and reapply it back in the ground? And Peter Wayne describes it as like throwing a punch. It's throwing a punch to the ground with your foot, right? So it's not a passive motion. It's aggressive and it's violent. Awkward silence. We're going to try to get this slide to load. I apologize. Right. Jump the gun a little bit. So now we're going to start talking about the stumble reflex. What the hell is a stumble reflex, right? The stumble reflex is your body's safety mechanism for when you fall or trip, and it's going to cause a pre-tensioning in the body, right? So think about it. When you're aloof, as some would say, right? And you go to trip over a curb or you trip on a sidewalk, right? And you're at next step, you strike the ground and it's really stiff and you try to catch yourself, right? That's a stumble reflex in a nutshell. Because what you look at the study above, and I won't get too deep in the weeds with it, right? Is what they did is they literally tripped cats, right? And what they found was when they tripped the cats or they gave them a stimulus to the swing leg or to the stance leg, there was a stiffer spring, there was a stiffer extension rate, right? There was a stiffer reflex on that flexion moment, a subsequent cycle, right? So what they found was doing that, they created a stiffer spring. And we know the stiffer the spring, the faster the velocity, the quicker we can decelerate, the more forces we can apply, right? And we know in elite athletes, their ability to accelerate, decelerate, and be a higher level athlete is their ability to shut off and turn on muscles and flip between agonists and antagonists, right? And we know it's based off this study and other sprint kinematics, right? Stiffer ankle complexes are going to create more vertical forces based off an elastic return. And we know in max velocity sprinting, higher vertical forces are what we're looking for. Here we go. All right, so now get into some towing research, because I know that's what everybody's talking about. That's everybody wants to hear, everybody wants to talk about. And sadly, we're not going to get too much into it, right? Because the nature of field sport athletes and being a strength coach is we can't do too much, and we talk more about it because of the safety of keeping our paychecks, right? But if you look at the study Ken Clark and Chris Corvus did a few years ago, when they pulled kids and they did motorized towing. Sorry, we got a big itch. When you look at the studies, what they did is everybody here hopefully know what a fly 10 is. If not, we can talk about it. But what they did was they set up a fly 10 zone. They took a bunch of high school age kids, senior, junior, senior, average to above average track sprinters, right? And what they did was they pulled them through a timing gate system, a fly 10 system, right? And what they found is by increasing their maximal output, right, above 100%, they decreased ground contact times by just a little bit more than 5%. That's fast, right? When you start talking about the difference between 1.0 and 0.89 or 0.8 in elite level sprinters, right, versus sub-elite, that's not a lot of time. But you start thinking about the forces and speeds created, it's a ton, right? Flight times were increased not by stride length or stride frequency, but because of higher levels of vertical forces when they towed these kids through. And what they ended up doing is there was almost a 9.5% increase in maximal velocity, right? And that's huge when you talk about the differences in times we have to do these things. And if you look at, and if you're versed and if you're not versed, if you look more into it and the sprint coaching and some of these higher other coaches, and again, like I don't know a whole lot. I'm just good at emulating other people. But you're going to see with track coaches and what a lot of high-level sprint coaches in the past were going to say is towing doesn't work because you're going to increase ground contact times. You're going to increase stride lengths, right? You're going to increase braking forces because it's unnatural. It's an out-of-body experience, and you're going to reinforce poor mechanics and striking in the front of the hip, right? And you're going to create braking force on the hamstring, and you could end up pulling a hamstring, right? But in reality, the situation is they went faster, mechanics improved, they increased vertical force, and they decreased ground contact times. And there wasn't a degradation or deformation in mechanics, right? So actually it improved, right? Now, what do I do if I don't like my job, right? Or what if I do like my job? I could tell you what you do if you don't like it. But what do I do if I do like my job, right? Most coaches probably can't or actuality of team and group settings or safety of because one is to keep the kids safe and keep your own hide safe, right? So they won't tow them, right? But if you were to tow them, right, it only takes a few steps to give an out-of-body experience, to give a neurological adaptation. Remember, it's just like a 1-rep max. It's an above 100%. So it only takes 1, 2, 3 steps for the body to feel it, right? That's why if Charlie Francis, if his athletes PR'd, they were done for the day because you want that one single stimulus to apply, and it doesn't take much, right? Al Miller always talked about to me as I was growing, even now, every time he reminds me, as soon as a kid has 100% plus out-of-body experience, stop. Right? Because the body's never felt it before, right? Put the brakes on and let the body feel it, right? Now, if you were to tow a kid, right, you could use a bungee hookup. I wouldn't in max velocity just for practicality, safety reasons. I think you could in some acceleration stuff, some stuff that we played with as a staff, as a group, as a CSU, personalities, practicality. I haven't towed kids just from I think there's better ways to do it in terms of efficacy and keeping kids safe. But if you were to do it, I know people that have done it with the 1080, if it allows in your budget. But again, in that area specifically in towing kids, I would say proceed with caution, right? And again, based off of research, you only need 103. You can get up to 103, 104% of maximal output, right? Now, the reality of what everyday overspeed you could do as a coach and as your group, right? A good strength coach should always know where the wind blows, right? You should always be checking the weather. 1, in case you need to go to a plan B session. And 2, like as a good sprint coach, it's always going to run with the wind, right? You're always going to run with the wind. Or if you follow TFC and you follow anything they do, right? And you talk to Tony Holler and you listen to him talk, right? He's going to refer to the gauntlet, right? And the gauntlet, all it is whatever your timing zones are, your timing areas, where it's 10s, 20s, a lot of the time for those guys, it's fly 10s, right? All the other athletes that aren't running are going on the sides of the gate, and they're providing an outside external stimulus to produce a fight or flight response. They give that athlete an out-of-body experience, right? Because it's a fight or flight response that we're talking about, right? We're trying to train the brain to give an adaptation. Right? Now, remember, our goals with overspeed and all this different motor learning, right, is we're trying to strengthen attractors and expose the body to fluctuations, right? Just to refresh and make sure we're on track and where we're going, right? James Smith, I think is a good quote. If you've read Applied Sprinting, if you haven't, I would. I know you're waiting for real answers and applied principles. I won't read this, but essentially what he's saying is all the drill work, this is where the biggest thing I've found in overspeed is for motor learning. is for motor learning is the drill work and how it fits into overspeed. And James Smith will explain it as it's a way to stress the body and strengthen attractors without giving too much neurological stress to the athletes, right? And again, I know this is a little off topic, but if you look at James Smith in the last point of this paragraph, a couple sentences, he talks about presenting minimal stress to the hamstrings, right? And I know with the COVID-19 and everything going on, great coaches, right, in these next couple of months and great head guys and guys who are overseeing and training, they're going to be able to judge their program and how well their kids are responding by the health of their hamstrings on a daily basis. If your kids are blown out and your kids are trying, you know they're fatigued and they're in a hard point of training and their hamstrings are blown out and you're not expecting it, there's probably an issue, right? The gauge of the health and daily readiness of your athlete's hamstrings are going to be a big guide of where they're at, especially going forward with a potentially limited schedule we have. Right now, let's start getting into some of the drill variations of what I use and what I like for me and what I've found useful for me and my athletes. Right, this all can fit in one-on-one sessions, group sessions. Right, but anytime we change the drill, we change the stimulus, we change the environment. We're providing a new stimulus. Right, we're giving a different fluctuation. As long as the attractor stays the same, we're trying to still maintain toe off, the MVP pose, right, mid stance, all these different things. Right. But we change the fluctuation. We're providing a new environment for that attractor to strengthen and learn, right? And that could be varying the arms, varying the hands, right? Stick variations, out in front, overhead, med ball variations. If you talk about the torque potential and the rotational component, sprinting and co-contractions, you can start talking about weighted variations. If you get into the stumble reflex and how the body reacts to the stumble reflex, you can talk about raised surfaces, right? Providing a new stimulus for the body to control. Right? It's all about controlled creativity. And as we'll kind of get here in a second, there's a method to the madness, right? When you think about this, anytime we do these different things, right, and you're going to see with a lot of these drills, anytime we provide a new environment, we change the drill, we change the environment, we change the stimulus, we provide a new environment. I apologize, right? We force the body to respond in a more perfect manner, right? We force the body to create a stiffer spring, to get to those attractors faster and use them more often, right? And a lot of the times you see with these different variations, the upper body, the more unstable it is, because the safety our body's looking for from the neurological piece, it wants to respond in a more perfect manner, right? So each variation kind of has its own different little piece of the puzzle as we're trying to solve this whole thing together, right? So anytime an athlete is late in their gait, they're late in their mid stance, for me, what I found works for me based off of what I've learned from Chris Korfis, Ken Clark, all those different guys, right? Boom, short wickets, med ball runs, toe off. You can use no arms, right? You can play with the arms. Captain Morgan's ever posted on my Twitter a couple of days ago. Stick runs. You could toe. Towing obviously works for all this. Again, I think it helps with toe off because toe off is the most attractive. Again, I just realized let me go back to this real quick because I know with this thing freezing up, we kind of skipped a couple of slides when it froze up. So before we get too deep in the weeds, all right, I just want to hit these real quick. Okay. It's being kind of finicky and loading, so I apologize for missing these slides, right? So again, we talked about all these different positions. Well, what the hell is an attractor for sprinting, right? It's toe off. Toe off is the #1 position for sprinting. It's being able to limit rotation and maximize force production through that stance legged, right? And like, again, we talked about, I'll rehash it real quick. And you talk about the lateral chain, like the obliques, the lateral oblique, the QL, all that hip musculature, they create stabilization in that stance leg, right? And then you talk about in the lateral chain, right? And you think about pushing, right? If you look back at the graph, we can look at it at the end, right? If you think about great athletes, if you watch a 5'10" athlete run and they run at a great speed, they're going to look like they're 6'1" if you're running from the side because their hips are going to raise. And you talk about that maximal vertical projection, right? So the opposite side of the pelvis has to be able to raise and maximize force output in that stance leg, right? And that's a great position. That's a great position and an attractor for sprinting, right? You talk about touchdown. Athletes are always cueing toes up, stiff ankles, right? Flex the foot, right? Because we're trying to limit the amount of planar flexion of the foot, because when you look at sprinters, they're going to have a neutral foot, and it's the ability, how fast can they strike the ground, load that ankle complex, load that Achilles, right? And then push back through it and creating force, right? And those ground reaction forces, those high vertical forces, and creating a return on energy, right? Again, I apologize. Let's just do this because it's going to be easier. I always save time. Right now, fluctuations for sprinting and field sport athletes as a whole. All right. We'll get this ship right, I promise. All right. So when we talk about fluctuations in sprinting, right? We talk about the difference between elite athletes and elite sprinters and high-level sprinters and field sport athletes and sub-elite, right? The biggest thing is going to be that high knee position, that maximal vertical projection, that front side lift. Again, most athletes aren't going to hit this, right? Because there's so many different outside environmental factors or sub-elite, whether it's velocity-based or biomechanical, they're not going to be able to hit this. But the biggest, they can, but the reality is in competition and practice and a lot of the things they do, they're not going to. But as they should be able to, the idea is this is going to change based off the environmental task, right? And then you talk about arm action, right? How often do our athletes and football players specifically, since we're talking about it, how often do they run in a purely sagittal plane with their eyes and shoulders right on top of their hips, right? They have to separate, they have to change direction, they have to do all these different things, right? And again, now you can kind of see how we're talking about these different positions now it plays into, and then we went over a second, so I'll kind of pass it real quick, right? Again, we kind of talked about that. I apologize for missing it. I was skipping through. I'm just going to do this because it's going to be easier. Again, before we start getting into the drill work, because I know we missed a slot, I want to hit it real quick, right? Again, ask yourself, what positions are my players in most of the time, right? Just like we talk about, track athletes have to run tall, they have to run sagittal, right? And their hips are on top of their shoulders. They have great posture all the time, and then they turn left, right? All our athletes, field athletes, have to do all these different things, right? So what positions and different positions are my athletes in all the time, right? How often in the open field, right? And you think receivers and DBs and safeties, you have to go track balls, their hips are separated from the shoulders. They have to go high point balls. A receiver has to track a 9 cut over the shoulder and their eyes are separated from where their hips are going, right? And all these different things are fluctuations in how we're coaching sprinting, right? And that's an environmental change, right? But they still have to be able to hit these attractive positions we're looking for. Right, and we got in the research a little bit. Again, I apologize. Right, so let's go right here because this is where we left off before we realized we missed some slides. Right, so again, now you can kind of see what the attractors are for our field sport athletes, our elite level sprinters, all these different things, right? And now, what do we use, right? When we talked about the quote from James Smith about how all these different drills give contextual sense, prep the tissues for work, right? The first thing most coaches do, and a lot of the great coaches I think that are great at developing speed and power in their athletes, most of the time they're going to start with an A walk, an A march, an A skip, and A run, and they're referred to as the MACH drills from Gerard Mach, right? But they give contextual sense to higher velocities and they prep the athlete for these attractive positions we want to hit. And also as they speed up, we're prepping these tissues and then preparing these elastic qualities that we want in our sprinters. And again, they promote coordination, rhythm, and relaxation. And some would argue that they don't necessarily fit the demand, but I would say there's an in-between, right? Everything has its place, right? But when it comes to the overspeed and some of these motor learning patterns that I want to drill, and I've found to work for me, again, we talk about motor learning, going slow to fast, simple to complex. This is where I start adding in some of these different variations we talked about on the previous slide first, right? Because it's the slowest thing we've done. It's the first thing you're going to get technical mastery in, and all these different pieces, right? So it's the first place I start, right? In the couple of videos I got coming up, or example of a return to play kid I worked with here this past winter at CSU, right? An overhead. We know any overhead arm variations are going to develop the lateral sling, develop that extension reflex. You can see it's just an A run. His ankles are okay. I'd like to see a little bit more of a neutral foot on ground contact, right? And again, from him, if I was really going back and trying to be perfect, I'm not the best with getting videos, recording videos, because I'm trying to watch the kid move from different angles. When I'm trying to cue a lateral sling, I actually want to watch the kid from the front and I'll watch him from behind, because a lot of the time I want to see him be able to get that hip lock position. I want to see that foot strike right underneath the hip, right? And again, because of this different A run, right, and all these different pieces, because they can get to that hip lock, they can get that extension reflex, they give that swing leg time to come through, right? And then we talk about that two mass model, creating higher levels of ground reaction forces and all those different pieces. Let's see if this next video will load. Here we go. Same thing, just a different variation. The same drill, an A run. It's the most complex. So I know nobody doesn't really want to watch the A walk, but you see him pick the speed up. His foot speed's okay. His foot and how he's controlling it's okay. There are probably some other issues going on. But again, you can see with the no arms, you can see the foot strike slightly in front of the hip, right? You can argue where different coaching can tell us whether it's right underneath the hip, whether it's 6 to 8 inches in front, it's somewhere in that in between, right? As long as it's not out in front or it's out too far out in front or it's in behind. But you see a vertical emphasis in his posture, right? You see a good swing position, right? all those different things we're trying to project and emulate with elite level sprinters and a full speed, the whole part method of what we're teaching, right? Now this kid's gonna pop up a little bit some of the videos, and I'll explain what some of his differences and issues are, because he does have some outlier facts, and we'll talk about that. We've mentioned a little bit about bandwidths and shapes and how they differ, right? Boom booms, another drill that I personally love. I first learned from Ken Clark, again, not my idea, not my original thought, right? But I think they have the biggest bang for their buck in terms of the drilling and be able to get speed and velocity and elastic qualities in terms of repping the drills, right? But the biggest drill they're going to have, the biggest piece of the sprint phase that I think field athletes struggle in is a mid-stance phase, right? Being able to get to that touchdown, getting those knees closer together, getting to that figure 4 position. Because if they're late in their gait, what do you see with most field athletes, football players specifically, going to do? Their hips are going to go behind. Because of that, they're going to retard their swing leg, right? So it's going to slow down. It's going to get out behind them. Cam Jossie talked about in his presentation on Saturday. And what they're going to do is that swing leg's going to get through late. They're going to heel strike and they're going to pull through, right? It's going to retard that next cycle. It's going to slow them down and create braking forces, right? So boom booms emphasize front side mechanics, lower limb positioning, as we know about that angular velocity in the 2-mass model, right? And for me, this is probably where I get the most creative in my drill variations based off what I see with the kids, because you can get a lot of bang for your buck, and like I talked about earlier, right? And just remember, before you watch this video, the more unstable we make the upper body, the more perfect the lower body has to, the more the lower body has to respond. I apologize. But you see here is this kid had sagged his hips, was notorious for reaching for lines and creating braking forces. So this was another return to play athlete I worked with in the summer. But we're trying to create a pre-tensioning in the ankle, stiff ground reaction forces. The stick, again, pressing overhead is going to be lateral sling. And as we're adding a movement piece to it, as we're increasing the intensity and complexity of the drill, we're changing the environment. And we're forcing him to get an upright posture, that foot to strike, and we're trying to get a good hip lock position to force that swing leg to come through in the position it's supposed to teach him those attractor patterns we're looking for. So when he gets in those positions where he wants to reach or do those things, his body neurologically, he's going to know to get to those attractor positions, right? To get to those golden positions within his bandwidth, right? Let's see if this next one will load. Apologize. Again, same thing. Right, a little bit of a pogo again, because we're changing the drill, because we're taking the stick away and we're giving some form of a hurdle, we're changing the environment, right? So we're giving another fluctuation to it. And all we're doing is the same thing. His arms are okay, being a defensive end, and, you know, he's pretty damn fast for a D end at a group of 5 school. He's like a mid to high 4.6, right? But we're forced with that. We're giving tactile feedback with the hurdle. And what we're doing is we're forcing that swing leg to suck up underneath, because we want a short swing leg to create angular velocity, to create higher ground reaction forces, because we know the first half of ground contact is where we get those peak vertical forces and ground reaction forces based off the 2-mass model research, right? So it's the same concept, different drill, different environment, right? But we're still training the same attractor position, the mid-stance phase, that mid-stance phase and that positioning phase and that hip lock, right? Those attractive positions we're looking for. Now you start talking about, first off, I want to appreciate, because I'm awful with getting consistent recorded videos and trying to focus on the kids and getting a new phone over the last year. So I lost a bunch of videos. I want to say I appreciate you to my buddy, John Garris. I hope you're watching now. If not, I'll ask if you watch later. For giving me a video. He does some great stuff in terms of motor learning and drill work, right? But again, you see the plate, you're like, what the hell is the kid standing on the plate for, right? Well, when we talked about the stumble reflex, or anytime we change the environment, we put the body in a position where it thinks it's falling, or the ground is raised or lowered, or it's a softer surface or a harder surface than what it's expecting, or forcing a pre-tensioning in the ankle. When we know that pre-tensioning in the ankle, we're going to get higher ground reaction forces. What does that mean? It means more vertical forces, right? So I'll go ahead and play the video and shut up, right? But again, you can see his forceful stiff contact, the stiff ankle contact, right? We'll watch it one more time, maybe, right? Again, because we're raising the ground, right? We're raising and they're lowering the ground. And for the next rep, I'd tell the kid to flip around so we even them out a little bit. But again, the ground's lowered on one side, it's raising the other side. So the body's being forced to change to learn a lot about adaptation, right? And pretense, because the floor isn't the density it expects it to be, and it isn't where it's supposed to be, right? So we're producing a fight or flight response based off the stumble reflex. Right? Now, another drill that I personally love is straight leg bounds, right? Because they help with ground contact, elasticity, pre-tensioning in the ankle complex, lower shank positioning, and that's that shin, that ankle, and relative to the hip. again, when they do all those things, they limit deformation in the Achilles and ankle complex by strengthening elasticity of the ankle, right? And all these different things. Also, I know these, again, I think they're just great drills overall, no matter if you vary them for motor learning and overspeed or not, right? But another piece of it is it builds specific strength in the hamstrings at a length that we're not able to train a whole lot unless we're going to specific methods in that fully lengthened position at high speeds, right? And again, the same thing, you can do all the different variabilities. The video I have isn't a varied motor learning wise, I'll show you next. But all these different variations can be done. You can do with a straight leg bound. But I think using the arms, you get a bit of a greater impulse. So I probably use these more regularly. But I think the ability of the overspeed effect in the ankle complex and the hamstrings and glute, I think shouldn't be forgotten from a motor standpoint, specific strength standpoint, right? Because the idea is you're going to whip from the hip. I don't want to see a lot of knee bend. Or again, I want to credit my buddy Austin with a video of a great video demonstration of some of the soccer girls from a few years ago. Because again, I'm awful with losing videos when getting new phones and breaking phones and recording videos as a whole, right? But what you can see is, right, is a vertical posture in nature. They're whipping from the hip. They're using elastic reflexes in the glute and hamstring, with most field sports can't use. So it's a great motor learning idea. And all these different variations we've talked about today and we kind of hit on a watch, you can use them here, right? Again, I just want to give you guys some ideas of how to do these different things and incorporate them. Another way that I personally like to use it a ton from a motor learning standpoint, limiting velocities early on in the off season, or just giving positions for just giving the opportunity for the kids to learn, right? Or some fly 10 variations, right? So a variation I could use could be hands out in front, a stick overhead, and then lastly, I'm always going to reset the kid with a free run because I want the highest neurological stressor to be last, because I want the body to adapt to that stressor, right? Just like if we PR, right? I'm going to shut the kid down after the PR, maybe not. But let's say if you go off of Charlie Francis' principle, he's going to PR. As soon as they PR, they're done for the day, because you want the body, the brain to adapt to that stimulus, right? So that's my process of why I always finish the complex or whatever it is with a free run, right? Another variation I've used that I like a lot based off some of the motor learning patterns we've talked about is wicked variations, right? You could do the first and second rep, right? You can shorten the spaces. You can improve front side lift, limb positioning, right? A faster limb, because we know if we shorten the space it on wickets from standard positioning, right? One, we're going to limit velocity. So it's not going to be as neurally taxing, arguably, right? But we also know because of that, things are going to happen faster. If we give a different environmental context to the situation, it's a new environment, it's a new fluctuation. So from there, we can force that swing leg to come through faster. And we know if we create higher velocities in that swing leg and better angular velocity, we can get higher ground reaction force. So that's the idea there, right? And then from there, you can potentiate it and you can give them normal spacing, right? It's still an environment for them to learn and get maximal hip projection, all those different things. And the great thing is about these drills is they're self-organizing. That's another part between all this is you want to be able to give the kids opportunities to learn for themselves and not necessarily rehearse. Now, if they can't hit those positions, coach the hell out of it, right? But the best drills are the ones where the athletes can figure it out themselves. Because when they can figure it out themselves, they're going to be more likely to use it and get to it. And again, the third, fourth rep, depending on how they're looking at what your yard is and all these different things you're trying to do for the day, the fourth rep, again, the highest and hardest neural stress, give it last. So there's an adaptation, right? So they can part, hold, put it all together. Good, you're done for the day, right? See if we can get this thing rolling. Maybe. All right. So again, same kid. This kid was I worked with in the fall. Previously in the last 2 years, he came off an ACL and then he ended up coming from a meniscus repair, which is a long process when they repair it anyways. But this is early, I think it was about week 3, week 4. We first kind of got into our fly 10s a little bit. I think it was like our first or second rep ever we did with it, right? And I know with this kid, he's a typical football player. He's a squatty runner. He's a pusher. He doesn't have great reflexive responses in his hamstring and glute. He runs a 0.98. Now for a kid healthy, he ran a 4.56, right? So that's pretty damn fast, right? On laser, right? On fly 10, we got the video of that too. I didn't put it in here because it wasn't really what we were talking about. But if you watch toe off, right, you can see him push, right, using low back and quad and not using his hamstring glute. And how I know that is because if I look, that's like within a split second of toe off. Look at the distal portion of his hamstring in relation to his glute. Look how far behind him it is, because a great toe off position is going to allow for maximal vertical force production and allow that hip to raise. So that hamstring should be directly underneath the hip. And instead it's behind. So I know he's trying to push instead of bounce. Great athletes and great sprinters bounce down the field when they sprint, right? And then what do I do? And because of that, realistically, the next rep, I really should have him run hands overhead, but I had him go arms. I had him go no arms as he entered the gates. He ran a 1.0. It's 0.2 of a difference. Again, it's not super fast, but I provided an environment and an attractor position and a prime attractor position we want to hit for him to learn and get to those positions. You can see a little bit of an increased hip projection, right? Giving us an idea of better vertical forces, right? You can see less lean, but you also see him lean in the second because he's a running back. And what are running backs taught to do? Get behind their pads or run behind their pads. So that's the idea of why a lot of these guys lean and push, right? But you see it limits a little bit, right? It gets a little bit better. And then again, what I say in the last potentiation cycles, the last one, we're gonna reset them, right? We're gonna put it all together, whole method, right? Again, he runs a 9.6. That's a 1/10 of a second off his lifetime best, right? And this was in a month of returning to sprinting, right? A month, 4 or 5 weeks, somewhere in there. I don't think it's quite 3. I wouldn't give a fly 10 kid. I wouldn't give a fly 10 to a kid that early, right? But you can see improved hip projection, improved toe off position, right? You can see that hamstring in a better relation to the glute when he gets the toe off, right? You can see it, you start putting a little bit together. He's a little less in his gait. He's able to get a little bit closer to that figure 4. When you get the touchdown, you watch a lot of these kids. The biggest thing you can watch outside of toe off is watch the knee separation, because right when they get the touchdown, the closer their knees are together, the better position they're going to be, because that means they're getting better projection, and the more likely they're going to be able to get that swing leg through, right? Because we don't want to be late in our gait, right? And again, this wasn't a part of the potentiation. This was a day where we were kind of tapering, trying to get him to higher velocities, right? And he ties his PR. This was 6-7 weeks. This is right before he went home for break. He ran a 0.95, which is a tie of his fly 10 PR, right? And you can see an increase in maximal hip projection. You can see a better toe off position. You can see him get to a better hip lock position, right, where he can push and extend and create all those reflex and ground reaction forces, all those different things you're doing, right? And you see less push. You can see more bounce, right? Because he was a twitchy enough kid, right? And to be honest, looking back at him and looking back at his numbers the other day, I wish I would have put him in here. But looking back during this cycle, we PR'd his 10. He went from a 1.53 to a 1.51. His 20, we went from a 2.71 to a 2.67. Went to a 2.67, and we tied his fly 10. And honestly, trying to incorporate so many things you have to do in return to play. If I would have tapered his volume in the weight room a little bit better just to get a PR in this day, he probably would have PR'd, right? But again, his volume in a cycle where we would do something that was probably a little higher than what we would do in a normal sprint cycle like that in a team setting. But he had so many other needs, but it was still impressive to see him tie in such a maximal high neural component under possibly a potential little bit of fatigue. Now, wicked distances, right? Because there's such an idea for motor learning and self-organization that fall under the umbrella for football and field sport athletes, OVERSPEED, right? I'm not going to pretend I know any of this stuff. A lot of the stuff for me is under trial and error, watching Coach Garasio, Austin Ardrey, coaches I've learned from, Coach Jackson, watching him from afar, talking to him a little bit. Vince, but to be honest, if I had to tell you one thing to take away in terms of wickets, look at Vince Anderson, Altus. Chris Corfus has some specific distances. I could put him in here. If you ask, I can give it to you. Chris Corfus has some specific distances for different outcomes he's looking for and problem solving he's looking for. And then honestly, trial and error. And I've heard it a lot today, coach's eye, right? The coach's eye is going to tell you a ton, right? I'm always going to go shorter before I progress to longer. I'd rather them look like they're running through tires and look like they're pushing, extending, and they pull a hamstring. I can always lengthen them, right? Don't pull the cake out too early, right? Keep it in there, cook it all the way through, right? Now, some ideas. Here's the first time this kid specifically, and I'm showing him a lot because he was a kid I made a point to try to get some videos on with some of the ideas I was working with, right? You can see an early stage return to play where one, it's a 20-yard build. It's not great in terms of maximum velocity. Let's see if it loads. But the idea is you start getting him into these attractive positions and providing some of these neural outputs he needed to get to in terms of the stimulus effect to see if it loads, right? But I use the wickets again for self-organization, for motor learning patterns. And again, the idea of I'm not so worried about the time because I know the time is not going to be as fast as a true fly 10, or I'll speed it up just a little bit, right? But I put the Browers on it because it drives intent, right? It gives a little bit more idea because I want it to be a maximal rep. I don't want it to be an extensive sub-maximal rep. So I put the Browers out because he knows he's being timed. He's going to run a little bit harder. And you can see him get, and to be honest, watching that first step, his next rep, if I had it on video, I probably would have told him to scoot up from the back of the end zone, probably take 2 steps up to get a yard closer so he's not reaching for that first wicket. right? Just to self-organize, right? Because the idea is you want them to touch down in the middle of each wicket, right? And you don't want them to be too far in front, too far behind in between the spacing, right? But the same idea is you want to see them get a good front side lift, good toe off, and get to that figure 4 position during the stance phase. And the wickets give you an opportunity to do that. Another way I've used wickets, right, is an extensive wicket ladder on tempo days. I've started like with some of our return to play kids I work with, and specifically this kid here, I used it a ton. We build it into our volume. We build it into our volume. And again, it's an opportunity to strengthen and expose them to those attractor positions and let them organize, right? Overspeed is more than just towing. It's about training the body and some of the dynamic system theories. Again, normally when it's more of a maximal rep, I'm going to keep the amount of wickets down from 4 to 6. And then when it's an extensive and I want them to feel the positions and get a little bit better up, I'm going to use 10 to 12, right? And you can see the idea. And now he's going to do maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 reps of this. And then he's going to finish his tempo session, right? And it's going to count into his volume, right? And you're still looking for all those same things, still trying to get all those different positions. All right, let's see if I missed one. Nope. All right, now let's talk about supply metric considerations, because I know there are some arguments you could argue they're overspeed, there aren't overspeed. But the idea is there's some pieces you can do to apply metric considerations in terms of the ankle complex you do that carry over, right? 80% of what's happening is sprinting, roughly over 8 meters a second. It's happening in the ankle complex, right? It's actually, so it's going to be more tendon and fascial ligament base than it is going to be muscular base, right? 80% of what's happening over 8 meters a second is going to be in the ankle complex, right? So when we're looking at these different plyometric considerations, the carry over to top speed and maximal efforts, we want the ground contacts to be 0.1 or less, right? Because otherwise you're going to start getting an argument of different variations, right? And these are some videos we did in our team setting, right? From last summer at CSU, right? We're going to do some resisted pogos, right? We're giving extra force to that eccentric point, forcing a stiffer contact, a stiffer spring, higher ground reaction forces, all those different things to prep that ankle, right? And you want to limit knee bend, all those different things, right? Because you want the force and you want the force production of re-injuring, excuse me, the re-emphasizing and a considerable portion of the force to be in the ankle, right? You don't want it to be, you don't want to be in the quad and the hamstring. Right now, you look at some overspeed pogos, some assisted pogos, right? These are straight from Tony Holler and TFC, right? You're increasing kinetic energy off the increase in flight time, right? There's going to be a larger eccentric load. And again, because we know from the 2-mass model, the idea of speeding up how much force comes down in that lower shank in the first half of ground contact, and the ability to limit deformation in the Achilles complex, we can increase ground reaction forces. So how fast can they increase their energy and then come back to earth, stop it, and reapply it, right? Now, you can take the same drill and apply the stumble reflex, right? Because we know that's that oh shit moment, right? To where they have to organize because they think they're falling, right? And what's going to happen is it's going to force a stiffer contact, a stiffer ankle complex. We know that's going to produce a stiffer spring, a stiffer ground reaction forces, and providing a fight or flight response to create increased velocities and overall in sprinting. And we can do this in our prep work. All these different things play a different role. The biggest piece in overspeed for us in a team sport and a team athlete, all the stuff you can carry over your drills, everything you do is the idea of motor learning, just from a practicality standpoint in a team setting, right? Another thing you can talk about session organization that I play with a ton, and in a team setting we've done a little bit in the last 2 years with Coach Gracio, right? Is if you rehearse it and it becomes organized and it becomes monotonous, right? And you can talk about where it's programmed in the athletes, all these different things, right? You can get to a conversation down the rabbit hole about choking, right? And rehearse reps, because the athletes have to be able to organize, right? But think about it. If you're right-handed and you brush your teeth with your left hand, or say if you always drive the same way home the other day, tomorrow drive home a different way, and see how much more you have to focus and how much harder it is, right? It's not going to be incredibly taxing. Like you're going to get home, you're going to be zonked, right? But think how much more you have to focus and pay attention. The body has to organize and figure out what's going on, right? So if I have 4 reps of boom booms, right? And I know I have 4 total reps, so I got it down and back twice, right? Every time I do a boom boom, once they get technical mastery, once the team or the group or the kid gets technical mastery, I might start changing it to where if I know those 4 drills, those 4 reps, I'm going to change it. One's going to be hands overhead, one's going to be arms across the body. One, every time he does a switch, I want to press his arms overhead, right? You're trying to expose them to fluctuations because the more they're able to get those attractors and fluctuations, the more they're exposed to those fluctuations, the more they're going to be able to get to them in higher velocities and higher demanding pieces, right? Another piece I've played with, I've yet to decide if I fully like it or not. I think it has a place, and I've used it a little bit with some return to play kids. Depending on your practicality of how you program your days and differences like that, you could flip your order of your exercises on a field session. You could do some change of direction, then come and do your Excel work, or you could do your Excel work and then you can do your Excel work and then do your change of direction work. Depending on how you break your days up and needs, a lot of return to play guys that have to kind of intermix it because you have to adapt them for sports, adapt them to demands of the sport and practice and different things. You could rotate that. I think for honestly, the best bang for your buck in terms of motor learning, in terms of getting maximum output and all these different stressors, I think it's going to be in your drill work, right? But remember, like I said earlier, if we always rehearse it the same exact way and it becomes robotic and rehearsed, right? The athletes forget how to problem solve. And we know when they get out there in the game, the sport and all these different things, and other schools, there could be 100,000 fans screaming. They're not going to hear you be able to say knees up, toe up, jump over the front leg, right? All these different cues you're going to use, right? So they have to be able to organize, right? And the faster we can get to these attractors and make these things happen, the more likely they are to be able to use them. We're going to be able to get optimal development out of these kids in production. So again, as we're kind of wrapping up and doing these different things, remember, if we're providing a resource for new fluctuations, new environments, for things that happen faster, to improve mastery of technical positions, and limiting coaching cues and improving the athletes to figure things out in self-organization, right? That all falls under the umbrella of overspeed and dynamic systems, right? All those different things kind of fall under the same umbrella. So I want to kind of broaden and force people to think, and including myself, about what all these different ideas really are, right? And why do all these concepts of overspeed work, right? We force the body to operate at a faster rate because we're changing the environment. We can increase ground reaction forces. We're decreasing deformation and ground contact. The stumble reflex, we're increasing the stiffening of the spring, tapping into the brain's fight or flight response, right? And motor learning, because we're changing the environment, and we're chill straining those attractive positions, and we're changing the environmental fluctuations to get them to be, the more use those attractors when they get to different positions, right? And to recap, right? Think outside the box. Don't follow the norm, right? Don't do what everybody else does just because they've done it for so long and it works, right? If it works, like, success leaves clues, but also do the research, look for answers for your own, look where people are getting success from, ask why they're getting it, right? And again, like, to get off that, never stop asking why, right? I think that's probably, people hate me and love me early on, and getting annoying is you want to know why, you want to learn, right? And then lastly, again, some problems aren't always fixed from the ground up, right? Just how do we fix problems from the top down? Because again, we know neural stimulus, neural adaptation comes from the brain. So how do we train the brain, and how do we get to respond better to these different environments, right? Again, if you need any of my information, you want to ask me questions, tell me I'm flat out wrong, I'm an idiot, whatever you want to do, or if you just want to ask me questions, or if you want this presentation, I can send it to you. All my contact info is here. I appreciate you guys for taking time to listen and hanging around. I know this is the last presentation of the day. And one last thank you. I would like to thank my dad. He's my biggest mentor, my biggest form of support I've had. He had a massive heart attack back early in the fall during the middle of the season. And I know for him, I wouldn't be where I was without him. And I know hopefully, I think he was supposed to watch. He said he was going to. So I'd like to publicly thank him and say without him, I wouldn't be here. And I know he just had his 55th birthday after a massive heart surgery. And it's a blessing for him to be here and for me to continue to lean on him and learn from him. Because like I said, if he wasn't here, I don't know where I would be. All right. I appreciate you guys, and thank you for your time.
Crushed it, Zach.
Anybody still listening or watching?
Yeah, no, we still got about 35, 33 people on YouTube watching.
No kidding.
Yeah, going to the comments. I'm not finding any questions. But just to ask some of the rotational stuff, I mean, kind of going back to like nearly the beginning of your presentation, I've had this, been sitting on this question. I don't know if you have any drills or cueing and stuff to either fight or that specifically tailor towards rotation or anti-rotation when you're doing sprinting drills, if you have anything about that.
Again, when you think about sprinting, there's a rotational component to it. But when you think about what's happening, when you think about what's happening within those rotations and what's happening and the demands of the sport, demands of the event and what you're trying to do, the body wants to rotate because it's getting a production of torque and it's allowing that spine to load. You can get deep down the rabbit hole about co-contractions and all these different things to providing a neural response and create more force, right? So some rotation and some force is good, but you have to look at where that rotation is coming from and why it's coming, right? Because if you see people kind of swing like this when they run, watch their feet, right? Because you talk about the lateral sling, right? I don't want my athletes to run on a tightrope. And if they're running on their tightrope and that right leg is walking too far across the body, across the midline, they might swing with their left like this. So is it really an anti-rotation issue? No, it's a gait problem. It's a biomechanical pattern problem, the swing leg, all and touchdown and lateral sling, all these different things, right? So you got to look at it and look at the full-fledged of what's going on in terms of that down below and above and piece it all together. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I would look at it.
Solid. All right, I'm good.